podcast. My name is Ryan Rosenthal, being joined again by Andre Ganuela. And today we are thrilled and privileged to be joined by John Brennan, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 2013 to 2017. Now, Director Brennan has had a very distinguished career in the U.S. government. He joined the CIA in 1980 and served in a variety of roles, including as briefer to President Clinton, Deputy Executive Director and Chief of Staff to Director Tenet. He also served as Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism from 2009 to 2013. He has since held a variety of kind of distinguished positions outside of government and recently released a book entitled Undaunted. Director Brennan, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's good to see you and Andre here, and thanks for the invitation.
So, Director Brennan, we're going to dig into a range of hot topics, interesting topics that have to do with CIA and the intelligence community today. But first of all, we wanted to let our audience get to know you a bit better. So what were your motivations? What was your inspiration to actually join the CIA? We know you had a decades-long distinguished career in there, but what got you to join?
Well, I think I was born with a bit of a wanderlust in me. My father was an immigrant to the United States. He came here from Ireland in 1948 and always talked about his homeland. And then I also just became interested in the rest of the world. And by the time I joined the CIA, I already had some overseas experience. I spent a summer in Indonesia in 1974. My cousin was working at the US Embassy there. And so I did a paper for school while I was out there on oil and politics in Indonesia. I also went to school at the American University in Cairo during my junior year in college. So I felt that the CIA was an organization that would provide me the opportunity to learn more about the world and my role in it and America's role in it. And thankfully, they did offer me a job in 1980.
Yeah, I think we're thankful as well because you really faced a lot of threats throughout your career and you've kind of dealt with them head on in a lot of leadership roles. But one in particular is counterterrorism. You spent much of your career dealing with Middle Eastern affairs and counterterrorism. And so I think it'd be great for us to kind of kick off our more substantive part of the conversation by getting your kind of overview of the state of counterterrorism operations today. Of course, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. We've kind of pulled back from other areas in the counterterrorism fight kind of largely. Of course, there's been some successes, but I'm curious what your kind of thoughts are on counterterrorism today.
Well, when I think back over the last 20 plus years since 9/11, there has been tremendous work done, not just by the United States, but by countries around the world in degrading these terrorist organizations, notably Al-Qaeda, which still remains an organization with some capability, but it really has been decimated in terms of its leadership, its capabilities, its operatives. ISIS clearly reared its head and took over large parts of Iraq and Syria, and then was trying to carry out terrorist attacks globally. And that also was an organization that was very much decimated by the international efforts against it. So I think right now, when we look at places like Afghanistan, that is still, I think, transitioning from the US presence there, and that the Taliban that are now in control are trying to gain control over the country in a very sort of chaotic environment. And I do think that the forces of international terrorism, again, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and some others, have been significantly degraded. That doesn't mean that they're no longer a threat or that they're going to continue to be degraded. In fact, they could reemerge in different countries, particularly those that have a very unsettled and unstable environment. So the future of Afghanistan as a platform for terrorism, I think, is to be determined. It will be up to the Taliban, as well as neighboring countries such as Pakistan, as well as the United States and others, to try to ensure that the terrorist organizations are not able to regain the types of capabilities that they had in the past. But again, this is something that I think bears very close watching. And also, I think the United States needs to maintain a counterterrorism capability throughout that area of South Asia and the Middle East in order to respond quickly to terrorist threats that may emerge.
So on that note about the future of Afghanistan being TBD, basically, I feel like, right before the fall happened and during the fall, there were a lot of predictions about what Afghanistan would become. For example, many folks saying that it would become a hotbed for jihadist groups. And while you do say it's TBD, are there any signs or signals perhaps that terror threats have intensified or evolved in some way since the fall of Afghanistan? I know Afghanistan has sort of receded from the headlines these days, but what signals do you see, if any?
Well, I don't see any indicators that there has been any type of surge or even an increase in international terrorism as a result of what happened in Afghanistan. I think there's a fair amount of violence still taking place in Afghanistan and a lot of revenge attacks among the various factions within Afghanistan. But at least until now, I have not seen any indication that given the Taliban's takeover, that there is a surge in terrorist activity coming out of that part of the world. When I think about Yemen, Yemen was also very much of a hotbed for terrorist attacks against U.S. interests, both in the region as well as here in the United States. And there is a bit of a ceasefire of sorts between the various factions there as they're looking for a negotiated settlement to the political disputes that have taken place there over the last several years. So again, I don't want to be too reassuring about that terrorist environment, but at this point, given some of the developments in Afghanistan and Yemen, and even in Somalia, where President Biden has authorized U.S. military to have a sustained presence there. Again, this, I think, demonstrates the interest of the Biden administration in keeping capabilities available to be used, but also trying to recognize that a lot of the local environments cannot be reshaped by the United States from outside. This is something that is going to take some time and effort on the part of the players in these countries. And basically, we have to watch what their attitudes and policies and actions will be vis-a-vis some of these extremist violent organizations.
So, Director Brennan, I do want to ask you about Somalia, just because we haven't really talked about it much on the podcast, given the Trump administration decided that the U.S. would leave Somalia, and now the Biden administration has, of course, as you mentioned, signaled that we are going to go back in and conduct operations in Somalia. What is the threat in Somalia, and why did the administration make this decision? And of course, given your kind of career and experience, where do you kind of see this going?
Well, I think what the Biden administration announced was that there would be a sustained presence there, while in the past, during the Trump administration, it was a series of short-term deployments of U.S. military. And that rapid and frequent turnover really did, I think, limit the opportunity for the U.S. military to be working with those Somali elements that we're aligned with. And so what the Biden administration has done is to return to some previous arrangements whereby U.S. military forces, and several hundred or so of them, would be there on a longer term basis. And therefore, there wasn't the need for all of these transitions. And because there's, first of all, a lot of security issues related to frequent in and out deployments of Somalia, but also you cannot be as effective if you, again, have this rapid turnover of forces in the country. So again, I think this was an effort to really address what the needs are there. It doesn't signal any great upsurge in activity. There has been ongoing counterterrorism work that is done with some of the Somali government elements that are there. But this is just, I think, a more rational, practical, and effective way to deal with the continued concern about radical extremist, violent terrorist elements that use Somalia as a safe harbor.
So when we look at the broader picture of counterterrorism, do you think that in some ways that the shift now to great power competition, the focus on China and Russia, has in any way negated our focus on counterterrorism, or do you think that that question is irrelevant?
Well, I think one of the things that any administration has to do and any intelligence community has to do is to look at the full array of challenges that the United States faces on the national security front. And clearly after 9/11, with the attacks from Al-Qaeda, but also the tremendous upsurge in terrorist activities that were emanating from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, other places, there needed to be that increased effort and the increased resources paid to try to address those terrorist threats. And I think it was very, very successful. Looking at the current state of those terrorist organizations that have been degraded, and then also looking at the state of global politics, the rise of China, looking at a very aggressive Russia in terms of what it's doing in Ukraine and in other parts of the world, I think it's entirely appropriate for the administration and the intelligence community to be realigning its resources, its expertise, its capabilities, its focus on those global issues that really demand the type of attention that I think the US is paying to it. That doesn't mean that counterterrorism has been put on the shelf. It just means that I think the emphasis is going to be on some of these larger global trends. But rest assured that there are still a lot of members of the intelligence community, of the national security superstructure that continue to pay very close attention to terrorist threats that are out there.
So in a similar vein, there's the kind of this transition of CIA and kind of the IC from strictly intelligence gathering, foreign intelligence gathering, and then more towards a paramilitary kind of capabilities and operational kind of standpoint. I'm curious about your kind of thoughts about this, maybe suggestion that this is what the CIA kind of transitioned into doing. Is it accurate? Is it a good thing? And now that we see this kind of reversion towards not necessarily like a sole focus, as you mentioned, on the nation state threats, but more of a kind of transition to, re-upping our capabilities in that sense. Are we able to quickly and efficiently transition from this more paramilitary operations more towards foreign intelligence gathering?
Well, when I think back on the CIA's 75-year history, the paramilitary aspect of the CIA's work has waxed and waned over the years, depending on global developments. When I think about Vietnam, when I think about Africa, Latin America, South America, other places, Middle East, there has been a great demand over the years for the CIA's ability to bring its intelligence capabilities to bear and through paramilitary means. And so there has always been a very close lash-up between the CIA and the US military. And frequently that lash-up comes in the form of paramilitary capabilities. And again, after 9/11, there was an increase in those paramilitary capabilities because we were operating in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and other battle zones. And so what the CIA has to do is to adapt and be flexible so that it can pivot when there is a need for that paramilitary surge, and then also to pivot when there is a need for other types of capabilities and emphases. That doesn't mean that the CIA became a paramilitary organization, far from it. In fact, most of CIA's resources over the last 20 years have been dedicated to traditional operational collection, analytic, technical activities that try to gain insight into what's happening around the world. Clearly, though, there had to be a significant amount of CIA's resources dedicated on the counterterrorism paramilitary front because of the demands. But again, I think this is something that CIA leaders always need to balance, having the appropriate alignment of resources with the threats and demands that are out there, but also ensuring that there's the ability to quickly adjust and adapt. And I think that's one of the features of the CIA and why the CIA was just so integral to the post 9/11 US response, because CIA could quickly move people and capabilities to Afghanistan. It were CIA boots that were the first boots on Afghanistan after 9/11. The first American blood that was shed in Afghanistan after 9/11 was a CIA officer, Mike Spann, who died 2 months after 9/11. And so CIA, I think, has a very well-deserved reputation of being able to pivot quickly in order to deal with emerging issues as well as crises.
So just to follow up to that question, I guess, I mean, it was very integral, especially in the lead up and the initial work that was done in the war in Afghanistan. And you mentioned, of course, Mike Spann, who lost his life in those initial weeks and months. But I guess one of my questions is, what were, and I guess still are perhaps the gaps in the traditional US military arms, like the Army, Navy, and so on, in dealing with these threats that would call upon like CIA to engage in more of this paramilitary sort of function?
Well, the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, and specifically the CIA, have specific statutory authorities in terms of what they are legally allowed to do and resources dedicated to it. The CIA has the lead responsibility for dealing with foreign intelligence and security services. And so frequently when there are these types of crises or unsettled and unstable and conflict-ridden areas, the CIA is the one that will operate with the local intelligence and security services. And frequently then, particularly in a hot battlefield environment, that's going to require CIA officers to have the capabilities, the resources, the paramilitary capabilities that they need in order to operate in these very difficult environments. So I don't believe that there are gaps in the Department of Defense capabilities in terms of the various services. Ideally, and this is what I think the United States has been trying to do over the last 30 years, is to make the various capabilities that exist within the national security agencies, whether it be defense or state or the intelligence community, be complementary to one another so that they can interoperate in the foreign field, so they can bring to bear their respective capabilities, their expertise, as well as authorities in order to basically be a force multiplier. So the United States government activities in countries overseas are going to be closely coordinated among those organizations that have responsibilities in this national security realm.
I think to kind of flesh this out even more, one such capability is the use of drones, and the use of drones, of course, kind of increased as that technology has been developed. And so, I'm not sure if our listeners are fully aware how a drone strike actually works, why drones are used. And so, Director Brennan, I think we would very much appreciate how the CIA, in conjunction with other aspects of the IC, use drones and what their purpose is, as well as kind of like the behind the scenes, what does the actual process look like? And of course, you're limited in commenting on this given, any sort of classification, but we'd love your thoughts.
Well, we can take an entire, seminar in college to talk about drones. There's been a lot of press attention paid to them. Drones are basically aerial platforms that are operated remotely. And so they're all piloted, but they don't have pilots on the platform. So they're called unmanned aerial platforms, or UAPs or UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. And some of these drones are not armed. Their function is to go over certain locations, maybe denied areas, and try to collect as much intelligence as possible. That would include full motion video cameras that they have on board, also the ability to collect some technical signals, and to be able to then hover over these areas, collecting information that can be then reviewed by those who are remotely located from it to gain intelligence and insight into what's happening in various areas. Now, some drones are armed, and there are basically two types of drones, armed drones. One are the ones that are armed and they fire missiles, projectiles, bombs, drop bombs on targets. The other ones are what's referred to as kamikaze drones or one-way drones. They're They're basically platforms that have explosives on them, and then they're guided into a target. Now, for most of the US government's counterterrorism programs that employed drones, I would say, more than 99% of the time that those drones were operating, they were collecting intelligence. They were observing terrorist hideouts. They were watching individuals who are coming and going. They were trying to identify who was a terrorist and who was a civilian. They were collecting different types of intelligence, again, on the technical front, because these drones had the ability to hover at great distance and height over these areas and to collect the intelligence, again, without putting a pilot at risk. Now, in the counterterrorism realm, the drones that were armed would be the platforms that would then be able to find those terrorist enclaves, those terrorist operatives, those bombers, whatever. And based on all of the data that had been previously collected, that was then stored and correlated, it would be then determined by the chain of command of the drone operators whether or not it met the threshold for taking a lethal strike. Now, there are many advantages of drones that are used for carrying out these strikes. Again, I spoke about no pilots on the platforms, their ability to dwell for very, very long periods of time over it to collect the intelligence. Then also the missiles that they fire are very, very precise. They're usually laser guided. And so the pilot who is operating remotely watches the missile leave the drone platform, go to the target, and that missile can be, its trajectory can be changed based on what the pilot observes as the missile approaches the target. So for example, if it's going after a terrorist operative and all of a sudden civilians or children or whatever come into the target area, that missile can be redirected. It's called shift cold, to explode in an area where there are no people. So again, the pilot can operate that missile with great precision. The laser guided munition can hit within basically inches of the target. It's under the control of the pilot, of those who operate the drones. And so therefore, again, it was used during the Obama administration, I think, to great effect. It's just like any instrument of war, it's not perfect. There were mistakes that were made. There were, unfortunately, civilian casualties that were incurred. But overall, the number of combatants, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and related groups was in the thousands, while the number of civilians who were killed, according to the review that we did in the Obama administration at the 7-year mark of our 8 years, I think determined that there were between 64 and 116 or so civilian casualties. And I would put that number probably closer to that top number. And that was tragic that any civilians were killed. But again, in war, those casualties, unfortunately, are almost unavoidable.
So you talk about, just a follow-up question, you talk about pilots, of course, or controllers who are able to view how this missile sort of goes in, where the missile goes, and how they can quickly divert that missile if civilians and so on come into the picture. And I think a lot of the drones that we've often heard of tend to be remote controlled in a sense. I guess as the military and as our defense sector focuses on unmanned capabilities, expanding those unmanned capabilities, we're starting to, of course, see more artificial intelligence systems, more autonomous capabilities being leveraged. How do you sort of foresee autonomous capabilities, I guess, affecting and impacting our use of drones in warfare, especially in terms of weaponized drones?
Well, it all depends on the rules of engagement. And these are the criteria that are used to determine whether or not a missile should be launched. In US counterterrorism programs that employ drones, there was always going to be a person who would have to make that decision. There was not going to be something automatic. So in the artificial intelligence realm, again, you could have arrangements whereby if certain observable conditions were found, that there would be an automatic trigger to some type of missile launch. Other countries that have drones might in fact try to employ that type of trigger mechanism. I would always advocate for there to be a human that would actually make that decision, because it has such tremendous consequence. Artificial intelligence can help bring to bear the considerations, the information necessary to make that informed judgment. But I'm a strong advocate of ensuring that there's always going to be a human who would authorize a strike. Now, you could use artificial intelligence again to help to prepare for a strike. You can even use artificial intelligence after the missile is launched. If something comes into the field of view that maybe a human can't detect. So there are a lot of potential uses of it. But again, I am a strong proponent of having humans make that ultimate final decision.
So just one more question on kind of drones and drone policy before we move on. I'm a law student, so I always like to kind of ask legal related questions. I know you're not an attorney, so we're not going to get into the nitty gritty, but I'm curious about of course, we require war authorizations to go to war from Congress. But when you look at kind of the special operations that are conducted, particularly, I think drones may very well fall in this category. What is the kind of legality of the drone strikes outside of traditional war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere?
Well, the President of the United States has inherent authorities, Article 2 authorities, that allow him or her to determine what is the best course of action in order to protect the lives of U.S. civilians and defend U.S. interests. And so therefore, the use of these types of capabilities are fully consistent with the constitutional and statutory authorities of those involved in it. And so everything, I guess, depends on one's definition of war. Even the authorization of military force is not a declaration of war. And the AUMF, which governed activities in Afghanistan and Iraq for the US, was used as the template or the framework to determine the affiliation of some of those terrorist organizations that were in fact operating in those theaters. So again, whenever there is any type of counterterrorism program that involves the use of lethal force, there, as you can imagine, a bevy of lawyers inside of organizations and across the interagency that scrupulously review the program, the rules of engagement, the chain of command, to ensure that it's all consistent with U.S. law.
So jumping into another topic now, we did allude to this with the artificial intelligence and autonomous capabilities talk, but there's certainly a lot of digital and technological innovation in the CIA. Of course, we have In-Q-Tel that exists, and we're seeing a lot of other innovation efforts in the broader intelligence community. But my question is on dual use technologies in the IC. So basically, given the nature of its top secret work, is CIA actually able to source the best capabilities from the private sector, given that perhaps government may have many ideas of what they need to research, what they need to build, but they may not necessarily be aware that the private sector may have those answers. So is CIA able to source those capabilities from private sector?
Well, the CIA's relationship with the U.S. private sector is as old as the CIA itself. There obviously needs to be a leveraging of those capabilities within the private sector for the intelligence mission on all different fronts, whether it be purely on the information technology front, on the processing, on the distribution front, networks, databases, computer systems, cloud technology, as well as the different types of different products that are used, let's say, to collect intelligence, miniaturizing some of the surveillance capabilities, leveraging different types of powerful batteries that can be utilized overseas. So there's regular interaction between U.S. industry and the CIA. And as you mentioned, In-Q-Tel is one of those very critical channels whereby the CIA and CIA officers have the ability to see some of these emerging technologies and capabilities, and to then look at them with an eye toward how they can, in fact, be an advantage, provide an advantage to the intelligence mission. And so there's frequently back and forth. A lot of industries, private sector companies are very interested in selling their products and services to the intelligence community. And so they thirst for that interaction. And then CIA officials, particularly in the technical, digital, technological realms, will talk to and engage with private sector experts to explain exactly what types of capabilities is the CIA in need of. And over the course of our 75-year history, that technology, there has been a technological revolution that has totally transformed the intelligence mission and the operating environment. And therefore, the CIA needs to take full advantage of whatever capabilities exist in the private sector, because our enemies, our adversaries, are taking advantage of them. So sometimes these are capabilities that we're going to employ in order to gain an advantage over an adversary, but also it's technologies that will allow us to understand what adversaries are doing and then to counteract the effectiveness of those capabilities.
So in a related vein, the U.S. government uses a wide variety of contractors. So of course you have some level of contracting where you buy procurement systems, where the CIA, other kind of U.S. government entities buy products from U.S. companies. But there's also contracting where contractors do work on behalf of a U.S. government entity. And so I think there's a lot of kind of maybe ignorance in respect of the American public in the sense of how contracting works, particularly in the CIA. And so what is the CIA's relationship with contractors? What kind of work do contractors typically do? And kind of how homogenous is this working relationship?
Well, it really runs the gamut. As you mentioned about procurement, say, of products. So whether you're talking about hardware or software or office furniture or computers and other types of systems, I mean, there's just a lot of things that the CIA needs, both at its headquarters as well as around the globe, in order to allow it to function. And so it doesn't produce office furniture, it doesn't produce reams of paper. It has to go out to different firms to do it. And so that's one area of contracting. The other area is contracting of services, as you point out. A lot of times there are certain types of expertise and maybe niche disciplines and capabilities that the CIA does not have in-house, but yet they reside in the private sector. And so let's say the CIA has a requirement over the next year or so for a certain capability, and it needs to be able to bring people in who are craftsmen of that particular discipline, and they don't have the time to recruit somebody and to train them up. And they'll want to have somebody who can hit the ground running because there is such an urgency for the requirement. So CIA will contract with different companies or people. Frequently, CIA officers who may retire have a certain capability, whether it be a fluency in a foreign language or specialized technical skills. And so they will come back into the agency. They're called Green Badgers. They are contract employees of the CIA as opposed to staff employees, but they go through the same types of security background investigations. They have to take polygraphs. They are full-fledged members of the CIA. They have top secret clearances. And so that's a mix of both products that need to be procured as well as services that need to be brought to bear. And as you point out, I think a lot of people, including members of Congress, really have a misunderstanding, and they hear contractors, that there are so many contractors at the agency. Well, I think the last thing you want to do is to hire people as staff employees if the requirement for, let's say, a surge capability is only going to be a year or two. And you may want to have those people on board as contractors until you can bring people on board as staff employees with the same level of expertise and capabilities. So this is where it's up to CIA managers and leaders to be able to balance appropriately that allocation between staff employees and contract employees.
You do illustrate quite well the importance of contractors and contract employees. My last question on this, I guess, is dual use topic. I mean, of course, we see a lot of the big companies that have involvement with the defense sector and the intelligence community. In your view, has CIA done a good job of connecting to the smaller businesses, for example, smaller businesses who may be tiny hubs and microcosms of innovation, but perhaps maybe deterred by the complexities of government, the bureaucracies, and so on, or may not know that these opportunities exist? Do you think CIA has been doing a good job of reaching out to those smaller companies and small businesses that may have these answers?
Well, I'd like to think that they're doing as good a job as they can, but they probably can, we all can do better in these areas. But as you well know, there are literally thousands upon thousands of these companies that emerge each year. And so, and the CIA tries to stay as au courant as possible in terms of where this expertise and these capabilities lie. The CIA does hold industry days. A lot of times, some of these smaller companies will affiliate with a larger company that has an established relationship with the CIA, and that's a way to get in the door. But the CIA, I think, tries to ensure that they are staying on top of these emerging capabilities and technologies because it's in CIA's interest to do so. But at the same time, I think it's quite difficult that in a country like the United States, where there's such entrepreneurial initiative and such technological developments, it's difficult for the CIA to be tapping into each one of these as soon as they emerge.
So you, of course, joined the agency in 1980. You kind of were focused in Middle Eastern affairs, and you studied abroad. But the CIA is full of people from a variety of backgrounds, and I think a lot of people who think of the agency think of students who study maybe intelligence studies or security studies or a foreign language. But there are a variety of opportunities that exist within the CIA, within the IC, and so you, of course, were director and chief of staff. You held very high-level positions within the agency that are kind of responsible for ensuring that the best talent come to the CIA. And so I'd love for you to kind of talk about how the CIA brings the best people in, who they look for, and how the CIA might be able to do a better job of attracting talent that might be looking to the private sector or elsewhere.
Well, the CIA is in need of so many different types of expertise. And I think there are over 70 professional disciplines within the CIA workforce. And it runs the gamut from, as you pointed out, people who have experience in international relations and maybe foreign languages, foreign area skills, but also logisticians, security officers, finance officers, lawyers, data scientists, information technology specialists. The CIA needs to be basically a fully operational organization relying heavily on its own workforce with those top secret clearances and the type of expertise they need. So there is a tremendous appetite in the CIA to get people from all different backgrounds, disciplines, professional experiences. So the CIA does go out to college campuses. It also has job fairs that it participates in. It seeks out, and I think increasingly so, and appropriately so, seeking out people at the mid-career level and to bring them in. When I was hired in 1980, it was rare for people to come into the agency at the mid-career level. It was always people who were coming out of, school, graduate school, law school, whatever, that joined. But I think the CIA recognizes now that it really needs to tap into all those capabilities that exist out there. You want to have people who have that in-depth experience in these different areas. So if anybody goes on the CIA website, you can see all the different types of job opportunities that are there. People who want to join the CIA, they are to apply online, and they can see, again, the wide diversity of professional skills and requirements that the CIA has, which are regularly updated. And yes, sometimes they can be maybe a longer background check than some people might like, but that's because the CIA want to make sure that they know who they're bringing into this very sort of special environment. And they want to have a real sense that they can trust these individuals with having access to some of this country's most sensitive secrets.
So, in terms of that, are we doing a good job at CIA to promote sociocultural and ethnic or religious diversity, not just in CIA, but the broader intelligence community? Because it's one thing, of course, to academically study, a region or a type of politics and so on. But it's another thing to, have perhaps lived in those contexts, know those contexts, and understand these communities at a more intrinsic level. So are we doing enough to promote that type of diversity?
Well, I think there has been an ongoing effort over the last couple of decades at CIA to try to ensure that the CIA workforce is diverse, is inclusive, and that there's going to be equal opportunity within the agency once people come in. And as you point out, there are a number of different types of people that sort of represent that diversity. Whether you're talking about ethnic, religious, cultural backgrounds, whether you're talking about sexual orientation, whether you're talking about individuals with different types of disabilities, there have been a variety of initiatives underway. I would meet with the employee groups that represented these individuals when I was director, and to hear their stories and their concerns. I think one of the concerns, certainly for people who may either be foreign born or be first generation Americans, they were concerned that maybe their cultural, ethnic, and national background would be a deterrent to their being hired by the agency. And I think in years past, there was some very, very difficult security obstacles to get over. Let's say if you were born in Iran or maybe in China. I think there's increasing recognition within the CIA hiring and security elements that if the CIA is really going to be able to understand what's going on around the world, we need to have as much diversity as possible in terms of people that come from different social, political, cultural, national backgrounds. And frequently, they are individuals who may have been born overseas or are first generation Americans. And so there has been, I think, a determined effort to try to facilitate the entry of these individuals, while at the same time not sacrificing the security requirements that I think are just inherent in a successful hire.
I think it's an excellent point, and I'm going to make an assumption that the intelligence that was able to be gathered in the run-up to Russia's re-invasion of Ukraine was probably so successful in a large part because of maybe the individuals who have lived in the area or who know the area very well. And again, there are benefits to having people who are from these regions of the world, that have family there, that know it very well on a cultural, kind of maybe psychological sense. But this is kind of getting to a very different question of the strategic release of U.S. intelligence in the run-up to and essentially during the Russo-Ukrainian war that just kind of happened. So Director Brennan, this was very much criticized by former members of the CIA, former members of the intelligence community, saying that it could kind of cause issues with sources and methods. It could be a strategic benefit to Russia. But at least in my kind of understanding of it, it seems to be quite successful. So I'm very curious, given your perspective on this, whether or not this strategic release by the administration was the right decision.
I have full confidence that the current leaders of the intelligence community, whether it be Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, Bill Burns, Director of CIA, and others, that they were very, very rigorous in their review of intelligence that was collected and then reviewed for a disclosure release. And I'm sure that they did not do anything that in their mind would have compromised sensitive sources and methods. That's a process that intelligence officials have gone through forever. When I was at CIA, we had to do the same thing. We would release certain information when we thought that by releasing it, it was going to benefit U.S. national security interests. but we would not release things that we thought were going to compromise these very sensitive collection systems, human sources, and different types of capabilities. So it's a balancing act. So I've seen a lot of these armchair quarterbacks that are out there that even some of my former colleagues, but also former national security advisor Bolton, who had a Washington Post op-ed where he was castigating the decision. I think he is totally wrong and off base. I think what the Biden administration has been able to do is to use that released intelligence very effectively to gain support of our NATO partners, to generate popular support for the support that we've been providing to Ukraine, both in terms of military assistance, economic assistance. I think that intelligence is very, very important to be used and to be leveraged in a manner that advances U.S. national security interests. If intelligence is kept to ourselves, if we're not using it in some way, then it's not worthwhile, and it's not worth the money and the risks that are used to collect it. But again, I think we have professionals who are in the government, in the intelligence community, who are very, very carefully looking at what can be released and what shouldn't be released. And I have no doubt that, again, that review was done in a very appropriate manner.
So in terms of, this, of course, was one such controversy, but there have been many controversies that have impacted the intelligence community and the CIA. And of course, I think there are sometimes questions of public confidence in the CIA and the broader IC. Do you perceive the CIA as having a decreased public confidence? If so, how do we fix it?
I don't know. I see a lot of things that are out there on social media as well as in the press. There's a lot of misinformation out there, also disinformation about what the CIA is involved in. And so I'm sure that some Americans, as well as people around the globe, believe a lot of the stuff that is out there. And the CIA has always had to deal with the perceptions of its activities, whether they be misinformed perceptions or accurate ones. And so again, there's an obligation on the part of the CIA leadership to be able to continue to carry out its mission, irrespective of the clamor that might be out there that may be criticizing its activities, because as long as it's carrying out its duties consistent with its statutory authorities, doing it ethically, responsibly. And so it's unfortunate that I think, as you are implying, that so many Americans have a distorted view of the CIA. And that's why when I was CIA director, I tried to speak openly, publicly about what the CIA was involved in. I think there is an obligation on the part of CIA leaders to try to explain to the American people as best they can, and to the world, what the CIA's mission is, its role, what it's doing. But a lot of times there are these very specious reports about the CIA that, the CIA, cannot be involved in refuting or confirming these reports. Otherwise, we'd be spending our entire day doing that.
I mean, that at its core, the CIA is a clandestine organization, and its secrecy is kind of paramount to its success. However, in that sense, DNI Haynes did say that there should be a more of a concerted effort to declassify certain things, to not have overclassification. I'm curious, given your perspective on that, do we need to pay more attention to maybe overclassification, or maybe keeping too many things away from the American people, and of course maybe having better coordination with Congress and other parts of the IC?
Yeah, I think there has to be a very determined effort to ensure that there's neither underclassification nor overclassification. And even within the US government, within the intelligence community, if things are classified at too high a level, maybe the access to that information is too sharply limited. And so people who need the information do not have access to it. So you have to think whether it's top secret code word, top secret, secret, or whatever, and what type of accesses we need to ensure that people have. But then more broadly, I do agree, and having worked in the intelligence community for 30 years or so, I saw many, many examples of overclassification. I can understand why people are very reluctant to have something be unclassified, because they're concerned that somehow it could be, in fact, used against us. And we have to be very, very careful, because there's so much that's available right now in the open source environment, that if you put out a nugget of intelligence, it could be correlated with something that might give our adversaries some insight into what capabilities that we have. So it's a very challenging balancing act between classifying and declassifying information. And I do know that there are a lot of individuals and professional intelligence officers who spend their days dealing just with this issue. So we can, in fact, I think, navigate what are some particularly tricky shoals.
So, Director Brennan, in rounding out this conversation, over the course of our podcast's existence over the past 1.5 years, we focused on a range of different threats, nation-state threats, counterterrorism, cyber, and of course, domestic terrorism and far-right extremism, which I think are sort of emblematic of what broader national security folks, the broader national security community, has been focusing on in large part when you sort of read maybe say Defense One or some of the other national security publications. But I guess, what threats are we discounting in your view? Like, what keeps you up at night that we're not necessarily talking about at length or at all?
Well, I don't know if there are any threats that we're discounting, but I think there are some that are not paid enough attention to, as you point out. We haven't talked about climate change, the national security implications of climate change. As seas rise around the globe, and global and coastal communities are pushed inland, putting additional pressure on urban centers, which is going to create more challenges for governments, but also migration across borders because of the lack of water, arable land, or employment opportunities. I mean, these are things that have tremendous implications for stability and for the broader geostrategic landscape. So that's certainly one that I'm concerned about. It's more like a frog in a boiling pot. When is it actually going to jump out of that pot? But it's certainly getting very, very hot, and literally and figuratively on that front. But also, I'm concerned about a trend that I see globally, which is the polarization of views within countries. And also the great democracy versus autocracy environment in the world. But when I look at countries throughout the world, including the United States, and this division between, let's say, right wing and left wing, those that are proponents of progressive policies and globalization and more global interconnectedness. And then I see the rise of these nativist elements and political parties, and those that are regressive in some respects. It's a clash within these countries that really is contributing to, I think, dysfunction of the governments. But I am very concerned about the nativist tendencies and those people who are opposed to continued global collaboration, cooperation, and maybe even, and also on the integration side. I do think globalization is inevitable, continued globalization. There are some strong forces against it. I can understand why people want to be sort of self-sustaining, which is bringing out some of this very extremist national, chauvinistic tendencies in different cultures and countries. But I do think that too many politicians around the globe, including in this country, are playing upon the fears of individuals, and again, using disinformation, are really providing obstacles to what I think needs to be greater interaction among countries. We saw what happened in the UK in terms of getting away from Brexit. And I think some of those tendencies are existing in a lot of different countries around the world, particularly in democracies, where, as we all know, democracy is messy, but it's the worst form of government bar all others, as Winston Churchill said. But the growth of I think positive sentiment toward autocracies is alarming. And this is something that I think democratic systems and officials in democratic countries really need to understand that as they trample upon some of these democratic foundations, and they're going to, again, a more regressive, almost ideological nativist approach, they are, I think, sowing the seeds of the demise of democratic foundations around the globe.
Well, Director Brennan, we could certainly go for another hour talking about all of these issues, but you've been very generous with your time. And so we want to thank you very much for joining us today. We really ran the gamut here on a variety of issues. And so for all of you listening, make sure to check out Director Brennan's recently released book, Undaunted. And he's, always on the speaker circuit, got a lot of great insights and perspectives out there. And so once again, Director, thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to talk with you, Ryan, Andre. Take care.
Thank you.